In April of 1876, a young married man died at a villa in Balham in the south of London, and the cause was recognised almost at once as an irritant poison. The suspicion fell within days upon a household in which every hand that might have administered it belonged to a person no one could rule out. The man whose death is the subject of this record was Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo, a barrister of the Middle Temple, and he was 30 years old. He had been married 4 months and 2 weeks. He died in a bedroom of a white castellated villa called the Priory on Bedford Hill, in the rising railway suburb of Balham, and he died over the course of 3 days, in full possession of his senses, denying to every physician who attended him that he had taken anything that ought to have harmed him. No one was ever charged with causing his death. 2 inquests were held. The second sat for 23 days, was reported word for word in the columns of the Times, and returned a verdict of wilful murder against a person or persons unknown. That verdict has never been disturbed, and it has never been settled. To understand how a death in a comfortable villa became a public inquiry of national dimension, the record must begin with the 2 women who lived in that house alongside the dead man, and who were, from the first week, the 2 figures upon whom suspicion principally rested. Neither was ever accused in a court of law. Both were examined at length before a coroner's jury, in conditions that resembled a trial in every particular except the presence of a charge. The first was the dead man's wife. The second was her paid companion. The record introduces them in that order, as the household itself was ordered. The woman later spoken of as the principal suspect was Florence Bravo, who had been born Florence Campbell in the year 1845. She was, at the time of her husband's death, in her early 30s, and she was a woman of independent fortune. Her father was Robert Tertius Campbell, a wealthy merchant with commercial interests in Australia, and the family had lived at Buscott Park in Berkshire in circumstances of considerable affluence. Florence was raised to money and to the management of a large household, and she was accustomed, unusually for a woman of her period, to the control of her own income. These facts are not offered as character. They are offered because the disposition of her fortune and her husband's interest in it stand at the centre of one of the motives the inquest examined. Florence had been married once before. In the year 1864, she married Captain Alexander Louis Ricardo, an officer of the Grenadier Guards and a member of the wealthy Ricardo family. The marriage did not prosper. Ricardo drank heavily, and the couple separated, though they were never divorced. While she was unwell and estranged from her husband, Florence went to Malvern, to the hydropathic establishment of Dr. James Manby Gully, for the water cure that was fashionable among people of means in that decade. Ricardo died at Cologne in April of the year 1871, of the effects of alcohol, at about the age of 38. Because Florence had separated from him, but had never divorced him, she inherited, under the terms of their arrangements, a substantial fortune. The figure most commonly cited in the record is in the region of £40,000, which was, in that period, an immense sum. From that inheritance flowed her independence, and much of what followed. After the death of Ricardo, Florence formed an attachment to Dr. Gully, the physician who had attended her at Malvern. He was then in his mid-60s, a man of established reputation, and he was married, though his wife lived apart from him, and had done so for many years. The attachment was conducted with discretion, but it was an attachment of a kind that the society of the period did not forgive in a woman. In the year 1874, Florence took a house at Balham, the white villa called the Priory, and Dr. Gully took a residence nearby. Her health in these years was recorded as poor. There was a serious illness in the year 1873, attended by Gully, and the record notes it without elaboration. These are the facts the second inquest would later compel into public view, to the ruin of every person they touched. The second woman in the household was Jane Cannon Cox, and she was of a different order of life entirely. She'd been born in Jamaica in about the year 1826, into a family with property connections on the island. She had married, she had moved between Jamaica and England, and she had been widowed in the 1860s, left with 3 sons to raise and with means that were straitened. To support her children, she worked as a governess and then as a lady's companion, which was the employment of a gentlewoman who had no fortune of her own. She entered the service of Florence in about the year 1874 as paid companion, and she was trusted in that post, and she was dependent upon it. She had sons to educate, and hopes referenced in the literature of recovering property interests in Jamaica. A dismissal would have meant destitution for a woman in her position, and that fact too would be examined as a motive. It was Jane Cox who introduced Florence to Charles Bravo in the year 1875. That single act of introduction placed all 3 of them in the house on Bedford Hill, and set in motion the sequence the record now follows. If you value cases preserved through court records, testimony, and verified documents, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening. The record resumes in Balham in 1875. Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo was at the time of his marriage a barrister of the Middle Temple, ambitious in his profession and industrious in it. He had been born in the year 1845, and he had originally borne the surname Turner. He took the name Bravo when his mother's second husband, Joseph Bravo, a prosperous man of business whose family wealth derived from trade, adopted him. He was, by this connection, financially comfortable. He was not, however, independently rich upon the scale of the woman he married, and the record makes a great deal of that distinction. Florence brought to the marriage a fortune of her own and the habits of a woman who had governed it. Charles brought a profession, an income, and a firm view of a husband's authority over his household and, in the state of the law as it then stood, over aspects of his wife's property. The witnesses who spoke of Charles at the inquest described a man careful, even close, in matters of money. He took a keen interest in the expenditure of the household and in the settlements that governed his wife's fortune. Before the marriage, the couple had exchanged confessions of their earlier attachments, as was sometimes done. Charles was aware of the connection with Dr. Gully. He had insisted that it end, and Florence had agreed that it should. This was the understanding on which the marriage was founded, and it was an understanding that placed the memory of Gully permanently in the house, as a thing forbidden and not forgotten. Charles Bravo and Florence Ricardo were married on the 7th of December in the year 1875. They took up residence together at the Priory, with Mrs. Cox resident as companion, and with the servants of a substantial household about them, the maids, the cook, and the men who kept the horses and the carriage. The marriage lasted a little more than 4 months. In that short time, the record establishes several sources of friction, each of which the inquest would later examine, as it searched for a reason that a healthy man should die of poison in his own bedroom. The first friction was money, and the management of the household. Charles pressed for economy. He questioned the cost of keeping Mrs. Cox upon the establishment, and he questioned still more sharply the expense of the horses and the carriage, which he considered extravagant. It is recorded that he intended to reduce the household, and that his intentions extended to the dismissal of Mrs. Cox. He took a close interest in Florence's money and in the marriage settlement, which had, at Florence's own insistence, been drawn so as to protect a part of her fortune from her husband's control. That protection was a source of tension between them, for it was precisely the independence that the law of the period was inclined to deny a married woman, and that Charles was inclined to resent. The second friction was the memory of Dr. Gully. Charles resented the connection, and the resentment did not subside with the marriage vows. The couple quarrelled over it. On a visit to Brighton shortly before the death, there was a quarrel connected in part to Gully and in part to the state of Florence's health, and the quarrel was of a kind the servants noticed. The record does not permit the reconstruction of what was said in those rooms. It establishes only that the past attachment remained a live grievance in a marriage of 4 months, and that Charles held to his insistence that it be wholly at an end. The third condition of the household was Florence's health, which was poor throughout the brief marriage. She suffered 2 miscarriages in those 4 months, and she was, by the account entered at the inquest, low in spirits and unwell. She had been advised medically to take sherry for her nerves, and she took it in quantity, a habit recorded plainly by those who served her. Owing to her health, the couple slept in separate bedrooms, Charles in his own room, Florence in hers, with Mrs. Cox attending upon her when she was unwell. This arrangement of the house, the separate rooms, the wife nursed by her companion, the husband alone across the landing, is a fact the record requires, because it bears directly upon the manner of the death. There was, in addition, a figure who had left the household before the death, but whose name the inquest could not leave out. George Griffiths had been the coachman and groom at the Priory. Charles had dismissed him. The dismissal arose from the expense of the horses, from Charles's dissatisfaction with the man's handling of them, and from an occasion on which a horse had bolted. Griffiths had been heard, after his dismissal, to speak words to the effect that Charles Bravo would not live long, that he would be dead within 4 months. Griffiths had knowledge of, and had had access to, a supply of tartar emetic kept at the stables of the Priory for the treatment of the horses. He had departed the household before the night of the illness. The threat, however, was on the record, spoken and witnessed, and it made him one of the hands the inquest could not dismiss. The poison itself was a substance in common use. Tartar emetic, which is the compound antimony potassium tartrate, was kept as a stable remedy and was employed in the medicine of the period. It was cheaply obtained, it was poorly controlled, and, of the properties that mattered most to this case, it was very nearly tasteless when dissolved in water. A bottle of it had been kept at the stables of the Priory. There was no burial club in this household, and no policy of insurance upon the dead man's life, for this was a wealthy establishment, and the motives the inquest would weigh turned not upon small sums, but upon a fortune, a marriage, and the security of a woman's livelihood. On the evening of Tuesday the 18th of April, in the year 1876, Charles, Florence and Mrs. Cox dined together at the Priory. Florence was unwell and retired early to her room, and Mrs. Cox attended upon her. Charles went up to his own bedroom. It was his habit to drink at night from a bottle of water kept at his bedside, and he drank from it that night. Shortly afterwards he was seized with violent vomiting. He came to the door of his room and called out for hot water. A housemaid, Mary Ann Keeber, heard him, saw the state he was in, and raised the alarm through the house. From that moment, the household was given over to the management of a dying man. The symptoms recorded by those who attended him were the symptoms of a large dose of an irritant poison. There was repeated and violent vomiting. There was severe pain in the abdomen. There was collapse and prostration, and a sinking of the whole frame that the physicians recognised for what it was. Over the 3 days that followed, an extraordinary succession of doctors was summoned to the bedside. Dr. George Harrison came first, being local. Dr. Joseph Moore attended. Mr. Roy's bell was called, and Dr. George Johnson. The family brought Sir William Gull, the physician to the Queen, one of the most eminent medical men in England. It was a parade of medical authority such as few sick rooms have ever assembled, and its members were in agreement upon the essential point almost from the moment they saw him. Sir William Gull told Charles Bravo plainly that he was dying, and that he was dying of an irritant poison, and he pressed the dying man to say what he had taken. This is the pivot upon which the whole case turns, and it must be stated exactly as the record has it. Through 3 days of lucid agony, Charles Bravo denied that he had taken any poison. He admitted only to laudanum, a small quantity used for the pain in his gums or teeth, an amount that could not account for the state he was in. He said that he had taken nothing that should harm him. He accused no person. He asked the physicians to save him, and he died in the presence of that great assembly of doctors on Friday the 21st of April in the year 1876, 3 days after he had drunk from the bottle at his bedside. A post-mortem examination was conducted promptly, for the body was newly dead, and there was no need of any later disturbance of the grave. The examination and the chemical analysis that followed established the cause beyond serious dispute. Antimony was found in the body, in the stomach and in the tissues, in a quantity consistent with a large dose of tartar emetic taken shortly before the fatal illness began. The analysts of the period could detect antimony with confidence, and they could identify it, and they could estimate the rough quantity that had been administered. What the science of the period could not do, and what no examination of the body could ever supply, was the one thing the case most needed. The chemistry could establish that a man had died of antimony. It could not establish whose hand had put the antimony where he drank it, nor whether that hand had been his own. That gap between the certainty of the poison and the silence as to the poisoner is the space in which this case has remained ever since. The suspicion that a crime had been done did not steal upon this household by degrees, as it does in cases where a death is first taken for a natural one. Here the poison announced itself. A healthy man of 30, dead of an irritant poison in his own bedroom, is a death that declares its own character, and the physicians declared it. The question, from the very first hour, was never whether Charles Bravo had been poisoned. The question was how the antimony had come into him, and who had put it there, and the candidates for that question were fixed almost as quickly as the diagnosis. There were 3 persons connected to the household upon whom suspicion could rest, and there was the further possibility that the dead man had poisoned himself. Each of these was a live question from the beginning, and the 23 days of the second inquest did not close any of them. The wife had been in the house. The companion had been in the house. The dismissed groom had spoken his threat, and had known where the stable poison was kept. And the dead man himself had, upon one account, said a thing that pointed to his own hand. That account came from Mrs. Cox, and it shaped everything that followed. She stated that Charles, in his agony, had said to her words to the effect that he had taken poison for Dr. Gully, and that she was not to tell Florence. The exact wording varies in the record, but the substance is constant in her evidence. No other person in that house of physicians and servants heard him say it. If the remark was true, it pointed to suicide, and it lifted suspicion from every living person. If it was invented, it pointed suspicion directly at the woman who reported it. This single unwitnessed sentence, spoken or not spoken in a dying man's room, is the fulcrum upon which the entire case has always balanced. The family of the dead man did not accept the discretion with which the matter was first handled. Joseph Bravo, his stepfather, and his relatives suspected foul play within the household, and they pressed for a fuller inquiry. Their suspicion and the discretion of the first proceedings together convinced them, and in time convinced the newspapers, that the truth had been kept from view. What the record establishes of the suspicion is this: the poisoning was recognised at once by eminent physicians who said so to the dying man's face. The dying man denied it and accused no one. The one statement pointing to a cause came from a single interested witness and was heard by no other, and the family's refusal to be satisfied set in motion the machinery that would turn a private death into a public trial without a defendant. The medical evidence, considered on its own terms, admitted of very little argument among the men who gave it. There was no serious dispute that the cause of death was antimony. The post-mortem findings, the condition of the stomach and the internal organs, and the results of the chemical analysis all pointed in the same direction, and the physicians who had attended the sick room were in accord with the analysts who examined the remains. The analysis of the period could identify antimony by its own chemical tests, distinct from the tests applied to arsenic, and the presence of the metal in the body was established to the satisfaction of the medical witnesses. The quantity recovered was consistent with a large dose of the order that a stable bottle of tartar emetic could readily supply. The sum of the medical evidence is easily stated. The science established the poison, and the poison's amount with confidence. The science was silent upon the agency, upon the hand, and upon the moment, and that silence it could not be made to break. Because no arrest was ever made, and because no named person was ever brought to committal, there was no investigating officer of the ordinary kind driving the matter toward a charge. This was handled from the outset as a coroner's matter, and not as a police prosecution. The Metropolitan Police did make inquiries. They looked into the tartar emetic kept at the stables, and they made enquiry concerning George Griffiths and the threat he had spoken. But the inquiries reached no committal of any person, and the ordinary path by which suspicion becomes a charge, and a charge becomes a trial was, in this case, never travelled. The matter passed instead into the hands of a coroner and a jury, and, in its second and greater phase, into the hands of the law officers of the Crown. Because there was to be no trial, the inquest became the trial, and it is under that head that the record must set out what was said, and by whom. The first inquest was held in the latter part of April in the year 1876, and it was held at the Priory itself, within the house in which the death had occurred. The coroner was Mr. William Carter. The proceedings were brief, and they were conducted with a discretion that later became the occasion of great public complaint. The connection with Dr. Gully was kept out of the evidence. Florence was not subjected to any rigorous examination. The jury heard that Charles Bravo had died of antimony, and they returned a verdict that went no further than the fact of the poison, making no finding as to how it had been administered or by whom. It was, in its substance, an open verdict, and it satisfied almost no one who considered it from outside the house. The newspapers attacked the first inquest as a proceeding that had left the essential questions untouched, and the family of the dead man pressed the same complaint through every channel open to them. The Daily Telegraph took up the matter, and the popular press with it, and the pressure mounted through the early summer. The complaints of the Bravo family, joined to the public clamour, reached the highest levels of the law. The matter came before the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Alexander Cockburn, and an order was made for the inquest to be reopened. It is a rare thing for an inquest to be held twice upon a single death, and the rarity of it measures the pressure that had been brought to bear. The second inquest opened on the 11th of July in the year 1876, and it sat until the 11th of August. It sat for 23 days. It was held not in the house this time, but at the Bedford Hotel in Balham, a public inn, and it was thrown open to the press and to the public. The coroner, Mr. William Carter, again presided, but the character of the proceeding was wholly altered by the presence of the law officers of the Crown. The Attorney General, Sir John Holker, attended and effectively led the examination of the witnesses on behalf of the Crown, a thing unheard of at an ordinary inquest. Counsel appeared for each of the interested parties. Florence was separately represented. Mrs. Cox was separately represented. Dr. Gully was represented, and the Bravo family also. It was, in every feature but the name, a trial, and it was a trial in which there was no prisoner in the dock, because there was no charge, and in which, therefore, every witness stood in some degree in the position of the accused. The Times reported the 23 days, at length, and very nearly word for word, so that the reading public followed the examination of each witness as a serial through the high summer of that year. Crowds gathered at the Bedford Hotel. A death in a suburban villa had become the business of the nation, and the intimate arrangements of a wealthy household were laid open, day upon day, before a jury and before the readers of the newspapers. The record of the case is, in large part, the record of that examination, and it is set down here witness by witness as the inquest itself proceeded. Mary Ann Keeber, the housemaid, gave the account of the night itself. She spoke of the ordinary close of the evening, of the household retiring, and of the moment when Charles Bravo appeared at the door of his room in evident distress and called out for hot water. It was her alarm that brought the household to him. Her evidence fixed the sequence of that night: the drinking at the bedside, the sudden and violent onset of the illness, the raising of the house, and the summoning of the first physician. She was a servant giving evidence about the private hours of her employers, and her testimony had the plainness of a person reporting what she had seen and heard without interest in the fortunes at stake. Florence Bravo was examined at length, and her examination was the sensation of the summer. She was compelled in open proceedings and before the reporters of every newspaper to acknowledge the prior attachment to Dr. Gully that her marriage had been founded upon burying. She was questioned upon the marriage, upon the money and the settlement, upon the quarrels with her husband, upon the sherry she drank, upon the separate bedrooms. She answered as a witness under a scrutiny that no consideration of her sex or her station was permitted to soften. What had been the most carefully guarded fact of her life was drawn out of her and printed. Her composure under the examination and the admissions the examination forced from her were reported across the country, and the reporting did to her reputation what no verdict could have done, for it required no verdict to accomplish it. Jane Cannon Cox was examined at still greater length and with a still closer attention, for it was upon her evidence that the question of suicide turned. She gave her account of the words she said the dying man had spoken to her, that he had taken poison for Dr. Gully, and that Florence was not to be told. The examination pressed hard upon the inconsistencies between what she said at this inquest and what she had said in her earlier statements, for her account had not been constant, and the changes in it were material. Her position was set before the jury, the impending dismissal, the dependence of a widow with sons to support, the destitution that the loss of her post would have meant. Every element of her situation that could bear upon a motive was aired, and every variation in her testimony was set against the single, unwitnessed sentence upon which so much depended. Dr. James Manby Gully was compelled to appear and to testify concerning the attachment. He was a man of years and of former standing, and he was made to speak in a public room and before the press of a connection that the conventions of his world regarded as beyond forgiveness in either party. His examination destroyed what remained of his reputation. He had had no part in the household at the time of the death, and no evidence placed the poison in his hand. But the inquest exposed him, and the exposure was itself a sentence of a kind. He left the proceedings a ruined man, and the ruin was complete and permanent. George Griffiths was examined upon his dismissal, upon the words he had spoken against Charles Bravo, and upon his knowledge of the tartar emetic kept at the stables. The evidence established that he had threatened, in effect, that his former master would not live long, and that he had known where the stable poison was, and could have reached it while he was in the household. It established also that he had left the Priory before the night of the death, and that no opportunity was shown by which he could have introduced antimony into the bottle at the bedside after his departure. His was a motive without a demonstrated mechanism, a resentment and a threat that the record could set down but could not connect to the act. The physicians who had attended the sick room gave their evidence in turn, and the analysts gave theirs. They spoke to the symptoms as they had observed them, to the diagnosis of irritant poisoning made at the bedside, and to the findings of the post-mortem and the chemical analysis. They spoke to the dying man's denials, repeated to each of them across the 3 days, that he had taken any poison, and to his admission of nothing beyond a little laudanum. The medical evidence given in this public forum closed upon the same conclusion it had reached in the sick room. The poison was antimony. The quantity was large. The manner of its administration lay beyond the reach of the science. Joseph Bravo and the members of the dead man's family gave evidence to the finances of the marriage, to the frictions over the household expenditure and the settlement, and to the suspicions that had moved them to demand a fuller inquiry. It was their persistence that had forced the second inquest into being, and their evidence set before the jury the material of the motive that stood against the wife, the controlling husband, the protected fortune, the resented economies, and the buried attachment that the marriage had been meant to keep from the world. At the close of the 23 days, the coroner's jury returned its verdict on the 11th of August in the year 1876. They found that Charles Delaunay Turner Bravo had been willfully murdered by the administration of tartar emetic. They found in the same breath that there was not sufficient evidence to fix the guilt of that murder upon any person. The verdict was murder by a person or persons unknown. It named the crime, and it named the poison, and it declined expressly, and after 23 days of the most public examination the period had seen, to name the hand. That is where the law left the death of Charles Bravo, and that is where it has remained. No sentence followed, because no person had been charged, and no person could be sentenced. Whatever punishment the case carried fell not from the bench, but from the public exposure of the proceedings, and it fell most heavily upon the 2 women and the 1 physician whose private lives the inquest had opened to the nation. The sum of that inquiry is this: a coroner's jury, assisted by the law officers of the Crown, and attended by the whole apparatus of the press, examined every person who could have done the act, heard the medical certainty as to the poison, and found itself unable to convert that certainty into a finding against any individual. The inquest did the work of a trial, and reached the one verdict a trial cannot return, that a murder had certainly been committed, and that the murderer could not be identified. The aftermath fell quietly, and it fell hard. Florence Bravo did not recover from the summer of the second inquest. The attachment to Dr. Gully, dragged into the daylight and printed across the country, had ruined her standing, and the suspicion that the inquest had neither confirmed nor dispelled clung to her without remedy, for she had no charge to answer and therefore no acquittal to win. She withdrew from the society that had cast her out. She left Balham and the White Villa on Bedford Hill. She removed to Southsea on the coast at Portsmouth, and there she drank heavily. She died at Southsea on the 13th of September in the year 1878, at about the age of 33. The cause was recorded as the effects of alcohol. She had outlived her husband by a little more than 2 years and 4 months. Jane Cannon Cox left public life after the inquest. The literature holds that she returned to the connections of her earlier years, to Jamaica, and to the family and the property interests she had there, and that she lived out her life in that quarter. Her later particulars and the date of her death are not firmly established in the record, and the record does not establish them here. She had come into the case as the woman who introduced the couple, and she had stood at its centre as the single witness to the words that might have made it a suicide, and she passed out of the account into a quiet that the sources cannot fully follow. Dr. James Manby Gully lived on in the obscurity into which the inquest had cast him. His career and his standing did not survive the exposure, and he did not attempt to rebuild them. He died in the year 1883, some 7 years after the summer that had undone him, a man whose long professional life is remembered chiefly for a connection he had conducted in private and been made to confess in public. He had never been charged, and no evidence had ever placed the poison in his hand, and yet the case cost him everything a case can cost a man short of his liberty. The death never resolved, no file was ever closed upon a name, no charge was ever brought, no arrest was ever made, and the verdict of the second inquest, willful murder by a person or persons unknown, stands today exactly as the jury entered it in August of the year 1876. That is the condition in which the case has descended, and it is a condition that has invited, in every generation since, a fresh attempt to supply the name the inquest withheld. The record has never been closed, and so the record permits the setting out of the 4 accounts that have been offered for the death, provided each is set out for what it is, a case that can be made and a case that can be answered, and none is set out as a finding. The first account holds that Florence Bravo administered the poison. In its favour, it is said that she had a husband who pressed economy upon her, who took a close interest in the fortune she had insisted on protecting, and who had made her confess and abandon the attachment she had valued. It is said that she had the run of the household and the opportunity that residence gives. Against the account, it is answered that no evidence ever placed the tartar emetic in her hands, that the settlement had already secured her money against her husband without need of his death, that his death by poison exposed the very connection with Dr. Gully she most wished kept buried, and that she nursed him and cooperated with the physicians through the 3 days of his dying. The case can be stated, the case can be answered, the record does not establish it. The second account holds that Jane Cox administered the poison. In its favour, it is said that she faced dismissal, and with it, the destitution of a widow with sons to keep, that she alone reported the dying man's supposed confession of suicide, a confession that pointed the inquiry away from murder altogether, and that her evidence shifted between her earlier statements and her testimony at the second inquest. It is said that she too had the opportunity of the household. Against the account, it is answered that no direct evidence connected her to the poison, that the remark she reported, if it was truly spoken, exonerates every living person and serves no murderer's purpose, and that the killing of her employer's husband could not have secured the post she stood to lose. The case can be stated, the case can be answered, the record does not establish it. The third account holds that George Griffiths administered the poison. In its favour, it is said that he was a dismissed servant who resented his dismissal, that he had spoken a threat against his former master's life, and that he had known of and had had access to the tartar emetic kept at the stables. Against the account, it is answered that he had left the household before the night of the death, and that no opportunity was ever shown by which he could have introduced the poison into the water at the bedside after his departure. His was a motive and a threat without a demonstrated means. The case can be stated, the case can be answered, the record does not establish it. The fourth account holds that Charles Bravo poisoned himself, whether by design or by some miscalculation of his own. In its favour is placed the remark reported by Mrs. Cox, the strain of the brief and unhappy marriage, and the ready availability of the antimony about the premises. Against the account is placed the manner of the death itself. A man who chooses his own end does not ordinarily choose 3 days of agony, and Charles Bravo, through those 3 days, denied to physician after physician that he had taken any poison, called for his life to be saved, and left no note and no known source from which he might have taken a dose intended for himself. The case can be stated, the case can be answered, the record does not establish it. Where the record is silent, it must be left silent, and upon the question of which of these 4 hands, if any, administered the poison, the record is wholly silent. The case did not pass out of memory when its principals died. It passed instead into print, and it has been reopened in print by successive writers, each of whom has arrived at a conviction the inquest declined to reach. A book-length study by Bernard Taylor, published in the year 1988 under the title Murder at the Priory, examined the case at length. A further study by James Ruddick, published in the year 2001 as Death at the Priory, argued that Florence had acted to protect herself. Others have argued for Mrs. Cox, for Dr. Gully, and for George Griffiths, and others again for suicide. A volume by Anthony M. Brown, in a series that invites the reader to sit as a jury, reopened the case once more for a new set of readers to judge. The writer Agatha Christie was drawn to the case, and in a letter to a newspaper magazine, published in the year 1968, she gave it as her own opinion that Dr. Gully was the killer, on the ground, as she saw it, that he alone had an overwhelming motive. A dramatisation made for the BBC in the year 2004, written by Julian Fellows, presented a solution of its own. The through line of all of this is a single fact. Each generation has convicted a different suspect in print, and the record has sustained none of them conclusively, so that the confident solutions of the authors are themselves the best evidence of how little the evidence permits. No forensic first and no change in the statute flowed directly from the death of Charles Bravo. Its significance in the history of such cases is of another kind. It is the standing example of a poisoning that a full and public inquiry, armed with the certainty of the science and the attention of the whole nation, could not fasten upon any person. And it is a landmark in the power of the Victorian press to stage an inquest as a national trial, to print 23 days of examination verbatim, and to try before its readers a case that no court would ever hear. The White Villa on Bedford Hill, conspicuous and still standing, became for a summer the most closely watched address in England, and the reading public sat as a jury that was never asked to deliver a verdict and never ceased to argue over one. The case sits within a particular condition of the law that governed the property of married women, and that condition is part of the record because the inquest made so much of the money. The marriage of Charles and Florence Bravo was contracted before the Married Women's Property Act of the year 1882, in the period when a wife's fortune passed in large measure into the control of her husband upon marriage. An earlier act of the year 1870 had made only a limited change to that state of things. It was against this background that Florence had insisted upon a settlement drawn to protect a part of her fortune, and it was against this same background that her husband's close interest in that fortune took on the character it had. The tension between a wife of independent means and a husband entitled by the law to reach into those means was not peculiar to this household. It was the ordinary condition of wealthy marriages in that decade, and the case dramatised it with unusual clarity, for here the money, the settlement, and the resentment stood in the open, examined day by day before a jury. The position of Jane Cox belonged to a different and equally characteristic condition of the period, the precarious dependence of the genteel woman who had no fortune of her own. The paid lady's companion occupied a place within a wealthy household that was neither that of the family nor quite that of the servants, a place secured entirely by the goodwill of an employer and by the continuance of a wage. A widow with sons to educate and no means beyond her post lived at the edge of destitution, and a dismissal was not an inconvenience but a fall. The record set that dependence before the jury as a motive, and in doing so it set before the nation the ordinary insecurity of thousands of women in the same situation, for whom the loss of a place meant the loss of everything. The poison itself belonged to the ordinary economy of the period, and that ordinariness is part of why the death could occur and why it could not be solved. Tartar emetic was not a substance obtained with difficulty or handled with suspicion. It was a legitimate remedy, used in the stable and used in medicine, kept about the premises of a house that kept horses, and bought and stored without the controls that later generations would impose upon such things. It dissolved in water without colour and very nearly without taste, so that a fatal dose could be carried in a bedside bottle and drunk by a careful man without warning. The poison economy of the age placed a lethal and untraceable substance within the reach of every hand in a large household, and the case is, among other things, a record of what followed when that economy met a house in which more than one person might have had a reason. The proceedings laid a wealthy household open to the public gaze in a manner that was itself part of the case's character. Servants gave evidence about the intimate arrangements of their employers, the separate bedrooms of husband and wife, the wife's drinking upon medical advice, the quarrels, the management of the money and the horses. A housemaid described the last hours of a barrister of the Middle Temple, and her plain account carried as much weight before the jury as the testimony of physicians to the Queen. The spectacle of a gentlewoman's private life examined in a public inn, printed in the morning papers, and discussed across the country was a feature of the period as much as of the case, for the press had acquired both the appetite and the means to turn a suburban death into a national serial, and it did so without restraint. Balham itself, in that decade, was a place made by the railway. It was a rising suburb of the south of London, a district of newly built villas along Bedford Hill, and the roads about it, put up for the prosperous middle class and served by the growing network of the lines that carried men of business to the city and home again. It offered respectability and privacy, the privacy that money could buy, a household set in its own grounds, screened from the road, governed by its own arrangements. The Priory stood among these houses as the most conspicuous of them, a white and castellated villa, turreted and ornamental, set back in gardens, a house built to be seen and to keep its own counsel. In the spring of the year 1876, that house kept a secret it could not surrender, and the privacy the suburb had been built to provide became the very thing that sealed the question. For the answer, if there was one, lay within those walls and stayed within them. The seaside town of Southsea, to which Florence withdrew, belonged to the other end of the story, a resort of lodging houses and sea air on the coast at Portsmouth, the kind of place to which the unwell and the retired removed themselves from the notice of the world. It was there, and not in the white villa on Bedford Hill, that the wife of Charles Bravo passed the last 2 years of her life, apart from the society that had read her confession in its newspapers, and it was there that she died at an age when most lives are only well begun. The two houses, the conspicuous villa in the suburb and the quiet lodging by the sea, mark between them the whole descent of the case from a wealthy marriage to a lonely death, and the record holds them both. The examination that ran through the high summer of the year 1876 remains, in its bulk and its detail, one of the fullest accounts the period produced of the private working of a wealthy household, precisely because it was compelled into the open by a death that no one could explain and no one could ignore. The columns of the Times preserved the words of the housemaid and the physician, the companion and the wife, the dismissed groom and the ruined doctor, set down day by day as they were spoken, so that the case is documented to a degree that few private matters of that century ever were. What all that documentation established was the poison and the murder. What all that documentation could not establish was the murderer, and the completeness of the record only sharpens the singularity of what it fails to contain. The inquest, as an institution of the law, had never been intended for the work it was made to do in the summer of the year 1876. It was, in its ordinary character, an inquiry into the fact and cause of a death, held before a coroner and a jury of local men, and directed to the plain questions of who had died and how. It possessed no defendant, no charge, and none of the protections that surround a person put on trial for a capital crime. When the second inquest into the death of Charles Bravo was reopened under pressure and placed under the direction of the law officers of the Crown, it was made to carry the weight of a trial while retaining the form of an inquiry, and the peculiarity of that arrangement pressed upon everyone brought before it. A witness at such an inquest could be examined and cross-examined at length upon matters touching the most private conduct of a life, without standing in the dock and without the settled rules that would have governed the questioning of a prisoner. Florence Bravo and Jane Cox answered questions in that condition, neither charged nor free of suspicion, and the answers they gave were printed as though they had been the evidence of a trial, which in every practical sense they were. The poison that had done the work distinguished this case from the great run of Victorian poisonings, and the distinction is part of why the medical evidence, though certain, led nowhere. The poison of the period that filled the assize courts was most often arsenic, bought at the chemist's counter for the destruction of vermin, entered in the poison book against a purchaser's name and a stated purpose, and traced when a death was questioned, back along that paper trail to the hand that had signed for it. Antimony left no such trail. The tartar emetic that killed Charles Bravo had not been bought for the purpose from a chemist who could be found and made to testify to the sale. It was already in the house, kept for the horses, a stable remedy standing where any resident might reach it, requiring no purchase, no signature, and no stated reason. There was, therefore, no poison book to be produced, no chemist to identify a customer, no ledger entry to place a date and a name against the fatal supply. The very feature that made arsenic cases soluble, the trade in the poison and the record kept of it, was absent here, and its absence removed the ordinary means by which a poisoning was fastened upon a poisoner. The manner in which the antimony was most probably delivered added a further layer of silence to the case. The evidence pointed to the bottle of water kept at the bedside, from which Charles Bravo drank at night by long habit, as the vehicle most likely to have carried the dose. Antimony in solution declared itself neither by colour nor by any strong taste, so that a man might drink a fatal quantity and notice nothing until the sudden violence of the illness came upon him. But a bottle at a bedside in a house of servants and residents was a thing that many hands could reach in the course of an ordinary day, and the record could establish neither the moment at which the poison entered it, nor the person who was near it when it did. The instrument of the death was therefore as anonymous as the poison, an object in common use, accessible to the household at large, bearing no mark of the hand that had prepared it. The reconstruction of that moment, the when and the by whom of the dosing of the bottle, the record does not permit and does not attempt. There was, too, the conduct of the dying man himself, which stood athwart every solution, and which the inquest could not reconcile with any of them. Charles Bravo was, through the 3 days of his illness, in possession of his understanding. He was questioned by physicians of the first eminence, told to his face that he was dying of poison, and pressed, plainly and repeatedly, to say what he had taken and how. A man so questioned, who knew himself to be dying, was in a position to accuse, had he anything to accuse, and he accused no one. He named no poison beyond the small quantity of laudanum that could not have killed him. He asked to be saved and gave every sign of wishing to live. If he had poisoned himself, he denied it to the last with a persistence that served no purpose. If another had poisoned him, he either did not know it or would not say it, and the reason for either silence has never been recovered. His refusal to supply the name, held to through 3 days of lucid suffering, is the innermost of the many silences the case contains, and it is the one that no theory has ever satisfactorily filled. The record, then, presents a death of a very particular kind. It is not the poisoning that was mistaken for a natural death and unravelled years afterward. It is not the poisoning traced along a chemist's ledger to a signature in a poison book. It is a poisoning recognised at once by the most eminent medical men of the age in a house where the poison was already kept, delivered most probably through an object that many hands could reach, in the presence of a victim who would not or could not name the guilty hand, and examined afterward more fully and more publicly than almost any private death of the century. Every ordinary avenue by which such a case was solved was, in this instance, closed before the inquiry began, and the inquiry, for all its length and all its power, closed upon the same emptiness it had opened upon. The emptiness upon which the inquiry closed was not the emptiness of ignorance, for the case did not lack for evidence. It lacked for the one connection that evidence, however abundant, could not by itself provide. The jury of local men who sat through the 23 days heard more of the private life of that household than any court of trial would ordinarily have been permitted to hear. They heard the arithmetic of the marriage settlement and the figure of the fortune it protected. They heard the sums quarrelled over, the cost of the horses, the wage of the companion, the economies a careful husband had pressed upon a wife accustomed to spending as she pleased. They heard the hours of a single night set out minute by minute, the dinner, the retiring, the drinking at the bedside, the first violence of the sickness, the alarm carried through the house. They heard the succession of physicians named and dated, the 3 days measured out from the Tuesday evening to the Friday, and the plain medical certainty that a large dose of antimony had done the work. And at the end of all of it, they were required to do the one thing the whole apparatus could not do for them: to lay the act against a name, and they could not. Their verdict that the murder had been done by a person or persons unknown was in one sense a confession of defeat, and in another a scrupulous refusal to go beyond the evidence. It would have been an easier thing, and a thing the watching country half expected, for the jury to have fixed upon the wife, or upon the companion, or upon the dismissed groom, and to have sent the case forward against one of them upon the strength of motive and opportunity alone. The pressure to name someone, after so long and so public an examination, was considerable, and the jury resisted it. They found the crime proved and the criminal unproved, and they said so in the plainest words the form allowed. That distinction between a certainty of the deed and an absence of the doer is the whole legacy of the inquest, and it was reached not through carelessness, but through a refusal to convert suspicion into a finding it could not support. What the 23 days had produced, then, was a paradox that the law had no machinery to resolve. A willful murder stood declared upon the record, and no person stood answerable for it. There was a poison identified to the satisfaction of the most eminent medical men in the kingdom, and no hand identified to hold it. There was a house full of persons, each of whom might have done the act, and not one against whom the act could be proved. The coroner closed the proceedings, the jury were discharged, the crowds that had gathered at the Bedford Hotel dispersed, and the columns of the Times turned to other matters. The persons whose lives had been opened were left to carry the suspicion the verdict had refused to resolve into whatever remained of their years, and the death itself passed into that condition of permanent openness in which it has stayed, examined more closely than almost any private death of its century, and answered by none of the examination. No later disclosure ever came to close what the inquest had left open. In the years that followed the verdict, no confession was made, no deathbed statement was recorded, no letter or paper came to light that fixed the act upon any of the persons the examination had touched. Florence Bravo carried whatever she knew into her withdrawal at Southsea, and died there without adding a word to the record. Jane Cox passed out of public view, and into a later life the sources cannot fully trace, and she too left nothing behind that resolved the sentence she had reported hearing. Dr. Gully lived out his obscurity and died in it, and the groom Griffiths, whose threat the inquest had weighed and could not connect to the act, added nothing further that the record preserves. The one man who could have named the poisoner, had there been a poisoner other than himself to name, had already refused to do so through 3 days of lucid dying, and he was beyond all further questioning. Every mouth that might have spoken the answer was, in the end, closed, and none of them opened again upon the subject. What descended, therefore, was not a mystery in the ordinary sense, in which a missing fact might one day be supplied and the account completed. It was a settled and permanent absence, fixed by the death of every person who could have filled it. The documents multiplied around that absence rather than diminishing it. The verbatim columns, the 2 verdicts, the later studies and the dramatisation, each addition to the literature, enlarged the record without altering its central emptiness, and the more that was written, the plainer it became that the writing could not reach the thing it circled. The house on Bedford Hill still stands, white and turreted above its gardens, a building that outlived the marriage, the inquest, and every person who had gathered under its roof in that spring. It keeps its counsel now as it kept it then. Within its walls, a healthy man of 30 drank from a bottle at his bedside and died 3 days later of a poison that everyone could name and no one could trace to a hand, and the walls have never given up which hand it was. The particulars that survive have the exactness of things set down at the time and never afterward corrected. A marriage of a little more than 4 months, a husband of 30 years, a fortune reckoned in the region of £40,000, a first inquest held within the house and closed in a matter of days, a second inquest of 23 sitting days from the 11th of July to the 11th of August, conducted in a public inn before the law officers of the Crown. A single unwitnessed sentence, reported by one woman and heard by no other, upon which the difference between murder and suicide was made to turn. A verdict of wilful murder and a finding that no guilt could be fixed. A widow dead of drink at Southsea within a little more than 2 years at about the age of 33. A physician dead in obscurity 7 years on. These are the fixed points, and they hold their places in the record with perfect steadiness, and between them lies the one space that no fixed point occupies, the identity of the hand that carried the antimony to the bottle at the bedside. That space has drawn to itself, over the long decades since, more argument than the facts around it can bear, precisely because the facts are so full and the centre so empty. A case with little evidence invites little speculation. A case with a mountain of evidence and no solution invites an endless labour of it, each reader persuaded that so complete a record must, if only it were read closely enough, yield the name it has always withheld. But the record was read closely at the time, by a coroner, by a jury, by the Attorney General of England, and by the readers of every newspaper in the land, and it withheld the name from all of them. It has withheld it from every careful reader since. The completeness is real, and the emptiness at its heart is real, and the one has never been made to fill the other. A man was poisoned in his own bedroom in a white villa in Balham in the spring of a single year, and the whole apparatus of the law and the press and the medicine of the age was brought to bear upon the question of who had done it, and the question was never answered, and it cannot now be answered, and the record, for all that it preserves, does not establish it. It is worth setting the case beside the ordinary expectation of its own century, for the contrast is what gives the death its peculiar standing. The Victorian public had grown accustomed, over the decades before this death, to a particular shape in the story of a poisoning. A suspicious death, a body examined, a chemist traced, a purchase found entered against a name, an arrest, a committal, a trial at the assizes, a verdict, and, often enough, an execution before a crowd. The machinery ran, in the general run of cases, from the first suspicion to the final sentence with a grim reliability, and the reading public followed it from stage to stage in the certainty that it would arrive somewhere. The death of Charles Bravo entered that public expecting the same progression, and it gave the public every stage but the ones that mattered. It gave the suspicious death and the examined body and the identified poison. It gave a public inquiry longer and fuller than most trials, and then, at the point where the machinery was supposed to deliver a name and a sentence, it delivered a shrug of the law, a formal declaration that the deed was certain and the doer beyond finding. The disappointment of that, felt across the whole reading nation in the August of that year, is part of why the case would not lie down, why it was argued in print for a century and more afterward. A public trained to expect a solution had been handed instead a permanent question, and it did not know what to do with a question that had no end. And there is a further quiet fact in the matter, which is that the persons most closely touched by the suspicion were never able to clear themselves, because the law had given them nothing to answer. A prisoner acquitted at the assizes walks free with a verdict at their back, a public finding that the case against them has failed. The persons in the Balham house were granted no such release. No charge was laid, and so no acquittal could be won, and each of them was left to carry, for the remainder of their lives, a suspicion that had been neither proved nor lifted. That is a particular kind of burden, heavier in some ways than a charge, for a charge can be met and defeated, and a suspicion that is never formally made can never be formally answered. It follows its object into every room and every year, and admits of no reply. The wife carried it to Southsea and to an early grave. The companion carried it out of public view. The physician carried it into his obscurity. None of them could set it down, because none of them had ever been given the thing that could have lifted it, a day in court and a verdict of not guilty. That burden did not fall upon the suspected alone. It fell also upon the household that had testified, upon the servants who had spoken in a public inn of the private hours of their employers, and then returned to service in a world that had read their words, and it fell upon the family of the dead man, who had forced the second inquest into being in the expectation of an answer, and had received, for all their pressing, the same declared blank the first inquest had returned. Joseph Bravo had spent the standing of his family and the labour of a summer to compel the fuller inquiry, and the fuller inquiry had confirmed only that his stepson had been murdered and that the murderer could not be found. He was left with the certainty of the crime and the impossibility of the redress, which is perhaps the hardest position the law can leave a grieving man in, worse than ignorance, for it knows that a wrong was done, and knows also that the wrong will go unpunished. The persistence that had reopened the case had purchased knowledge without remedy, and knowledge without remedy is a thing that gnaws. So the case came to rest, if rest is the word for a thing that has never stopped being argued, in a condition unusual even among the unsolved. It possessed a proven crime, a named and identified means, a small and fixed circle of persons within whose number the guilt must lie, and an examination of that circle more thorough and more public than the century afforded to most of the crimes it did solve. All the elements of a solution were present except the solution itself. The guilty person, upon any reading of the evidence, sat within a company that could be counted upon the fingers of one hand, and yet no reading of the evidence, then or since, has been able to say which of that small company it was. The circle is closed, and the name within it is dark, and the record which preserves the circle in the fullest detail has never lit the name. The counting of that small company is itself a plain exercise, and the plainness of it is part of the case's grip. Set aside the physicians, who came only after the poison was already in the body, and who had no interest in the death. Set aside the servants, save as they carried and prepared the ordinary vessels of the house. What remains is a company that any hand can number. There is the wife, resident, with a settlement to guard, and an old attachment to bury. There is the companion, resident, with a dismissal before her, and destitution behind the dismissal, and with the single reported sentence that only she had heard. There is the dismissed groom, no longer resident but lately of the house, with his spoken threat and his knowledge of where the stable poison stood. And there is the dead man himself, who had the readiest access of all to the bottle at his own bedside, and who denied to the last that he had used it against himself. 4 names, and no more than 4, and within those 4 the truth of the death is certainly contained, and none of the 4 can be lit by the evidence that surrounds them all. It is this that has made the case the standing instance of its kind, the poisoning that a great inquiry could not fasten upon anyone. Other unsolved deaths of the century were unsolved for want of evidence, for a body never found, a witness never traced, a poison never proved. This one was unsolved in the presence of evidence, in the full glare of the most public examination the age could mount. With the body examined and the poison proved, and the suspects named and questioned under oath. The failure here was not a failure to gather. It was a failure to convert, the failure of a mass of established fact to yield a single, further fact that would have joined the crime to a criminal. And that failure occurring where it did in the open before the nation, with every advantage of law and medicine and press brought to bear, is precisely why the death has never been allowed to settle, and why each generation has taken up the same closed circle of 4, and tried once more to light the name within it, and failed as the inquest failed. There is a particular quality to the ordinariness of it that the years have not worn away. The vehicle of the death, upon the reading the evidence best supports, was nothing more sinister than a bottle of water kept at a bedside, the commonest object in any bedroom in England, filled and set out as a matter of nightly routine by hands that meant nothing by it. A man of settled habits reached for it in the dark, as he had reached for it 100 nights before, and drank, and set it down, and lay back, and for a short while nothing was wrong. The poison it carried announced itself by no colour in the glass, and no bitterness on the tongue, so that the ordinary act of a thirsty man, at the close of a long day, was on this one night the act that killed him, and he could not have known it in the doing. That is the quiet horror of the antimony, not any violence in its administration, but the absence of violence, the way it could ride unnoticed in the plainest vessel of domestic life, and do its work through a habit as innocent as thirst. The house gave no warning, and the water gave no warning, and the man who drank had no warning, and by the time the warning came, in the first turn of the sickness, the dose was already in him, and beyond recall. Around that single unremarkable act, the whole vast structure of the case was afterward built. The 2 inquests, the 23 days, the columns of newsprint, the century of argument. All of it reaches back to a bottle on a nightstand, and a man who drank from it, and to the unanswered question of whose hand had made the water deadly, and when. The structure is enormous, and the act at its root is tiny, and the disproportion between them is felt in every account that has ever been given of the death. A nation's attention, the labour of the Crown's law officers, the eminence of the Queen's own physician, all of it bent upon a suburban bedroom and a glass of water, and none of it able to say the one small thing that would have made sense of the whole, which is the name of the person who stood by that bottle, unobserved, and turned an ordinary night into the last of a young man's life. In time the death acquired a name of its own, a name that fixed it to its place rather than to any person, and that fact is itself telling. It came to be spoken of by the district in which it happened, the quiet name of a South London suburb, attached forever to a killing that suburb never solved, so that a word that had meant only a set of new villas along a railway line came also to mean an unanswered death. That naming by place rather than by culprit is the natural form for a case in which the culprit was never found. Where a poisoner is convicted, the crime takes the poisoner's name and carries it down the years. Where no poisoner is named, the crime takes instead the name of the ground it stood on, and the ground keeps the name, whether it will or no. The White Villa on Bedford Hill did not choose to become the fixed address of an unsolved death, but it became so, and the district about it carried the association through every decade that followed, a respectable suburb bound permanently to the one question it could not put down. And the question, stripped of all its long apparatus, was always the same, small and human question, asked in that first hour by the physicians at the bedside, and never answered in all the years since. Not what killed him, for that was known within the day. Not whether he was killed, for the second inquest declared it upon oath. Only who, and only how the poison came to be where he drank it, and only whether the hand that put it there was another's or his own. Upon that question, the record is full at every edge and empty at the centre, and it has stayed so through the deaths of all who knew, through 2 inquests and 100 and more years of argument, through every confident solution offered in print and refuted by the next. The certainty of the crime and the darkness over the criminals stand today exactly where the jury left them in the August of that year, and there they remain. What remains to any reader now is the record itself, and the record is unusually complete for a private death of its time, because the second inquest was reported not in summary, but in full. A person coming to the case today may still follow the examination very nearly as the readers of that summer followed it, question by question and answer by answer, may read the housemaid's account of the night and the wife's admissions under long pressure, and the companion's shifting evidence, and the doctor's plain testimony to the poison, all set down in the order they were given. It is a rare thing to be able to sit at this distance, so close to the actual words of a Victorian inquiry, and the rareness is a direct consequence of the very publicity that ruined the persons it exposed. The press that stripped Florence Bravo and Dr. Gully of their standing also preserved, in the stripping, the fullest transcript the case could have had, so that the instrument of their disgrace became the instrument of the record's survival. A reader may weigh the evidence now with the same materials the jury weighed it with, and may arrive, as the jury arrived, at the certainty of the murder and the impossibility of the name. And that is the peculiar invitation the case has always extended, and the peculiar frustration built into it. The materials are there, laid out and legible, seeming to promise that a careful enough reading must at last resolve them. Generation after generation has accepted the invitation, has read the transcript and the studies, has weighed the wife against the companion, against the groom, against the possibility of the man's own hand, and has come away with a verdict of its own, delivered with confidence and contradicted by the next reader's verdict, delivered with equal confidence. The record supports the making of a case against any of the four, and the answering of that case in turn, and it supports the fixing of guilt upon none. It is complete enough to sustain endless argument, and incomplete in the one particular that would end the argument, and it has held that shape, unchanged, since the jury rose. There is one figure in the account who tends to be lost in the argument, and that is the man at the centre of it, the one whose death set the whole machinery in motion, and who is remembered now almost entirely for the manner of his dying rather than for anything he did while he lived. Charles Bravo was 30 years old, a working barrister of the Middle Temple, at the beginning of a career and a little more than 4 months into a marriage, when he drank from the bottle at his bedside. Whatever ambitions he had carried into his profession, whatever he might have made of the years the poison took from him, are not part of the record, because the record begins in earnest only with his death. He entered history not as a barrister of promise, but as a victim of an unsolved poisoning, and the case that bears the name of the district has very nearly effaced the person of the man it killed. The long dispute over who ended his life has left small room for the life itself, so that he survives chiefly as the drinker of the fatal glass and the denier of his own poisoning through 3 days of pain. Yet it is his conduct in those 3 days, more than any other single thing, that has kept the question of suicide from ever being closed, and has kept the question of murder from ever being simple. A man who wished to die does not, as a rule, spend his dying breath calling for physicians and denying that he has taken anything. A man who's been murdered and knows it is in a position to accuse, and commonly does. Charles Bravo did neither. He fought to live and named no poison and accused no person. And in that refusal, whether it was the refusal of a man who did not know what had happened to him, or of a man who knew and would not say, lies the deepest of the case's silences. Everything else in the record can be read more than one way. That too can be read more than one way, and it is the one silence that no reading has ever managed to break, the still centre around which a century of argument has turned without ever once touching it. The whole of it, from beginning to end, was compassed within a very short span of time, and the compression is part of what makes the case sit so strangely in the memory. A marriage in the December, a death in the April following, a first inquest within days of the death, a second inquest through the July and August of that same year. The entire arc from the wedding that joined these people under one roof to the verdict that declared one of them a murderer and named no one occupied a little more than 8 months. Within that narrow frame, a young man met and married a woman of fortune, took up residence in her house, quarrelled over money and over the past, fell ill in the night, died in 3 days, and became the subject of the longest and most public inquest the period had seen. Lives that had been ordinary and private in the winter were by the end of the summer the property of every newspaper reader in the country, their quarrels and their debts and their most guarded secrets set out in print for the nation to weigh. The speed of that transformation from private household to national spectacle in the turning of a few months, has few parallels in the century, and it happened because a single death refused to be ordinary and dragged everything around it into the light. What the light revealed in the end was a great deal about how these people had lived, and almost nothing about how one of them had died at another's hand, if indeed it was at another's hand. The illumination fell everywhere except upon the one spot it was meant to reach. It showed the marriage, and the money, and the old attachment, and the resented economies, and the dismissed servant's threat, showed them in more detail than the persons concerned would ever have chosen to allow, and it stopped short, always at the bottle and the hand. Everything approaching the fatal act was lit. The act itself stayed in shadow, and the shadow has never lifted, and the fullest inquiry the age could mount went to its close, with the crime established and the criminal unfound. It stands for that reason as a kind of boundary marker in the history of such inquiries, a case that shows the outer limit of what evidence alone can accomplish. There is a comfortable assumption, easy to hold and hard to give up, that a sufficiency of facts will always in the end produce the truth, that if only enough is known and enough is examined, the answer must at last appear. The death of Charles Bravo stands against that assumption. Here was a sufficiency of facts as great as the century could assemble, gathered by the most capable hands the law and medicine could put to the work, and the answer did not appear. The facts crowded up to the very edge of the truth and could not cross it. They established the crime past doubting and left the criminal past finding, and no addition to them, in all the years since, has been able to carry them the last short distance. It is a humbling thing, and the case has been felt as humbling ever since, a demonstration that there are questions to which the full apparatus of inquiry may be brought, and which will still, at the last, return no answer. That lesson, if it is a lesson, was learned at a heavy price by the small number of people whose lives were open to teach it. None of them had asked to become an illustration of the limits of evidence. They had asked, at most, to keep their private arrangements private, and instead their arrangements were made the material of a national exercise that reached no conclusion and undid them all the same. The wife, the companion, the physician, each paid in full the cost of an inquiry that acquitted no one because it convicted no one, and each paid it for a result that was no result, a verdict that named a crime and stopped. The price was real, and the return was nothing, or nothing but the permanent openness of a question, and they carried that openness away with them into their separate ruins and their separate graves, and it did not close when they did. When the summer ended, the noise ended with it. The crowds that had pressed about the Bedford Hotel went back to their own concerns. The reporters who had filled column after column turned to the next matter that would sell a paper, and the death that had held the nation for the length of a season slipped within a year or two out of the daily attention it had so completely commanded. That is the ordinary fate of even the loudest sensation, to be loud for its hour and then to subside. And the Bravo case subsided like the rest, but it subsided without resolving, and a thing that subsides without resolving does not truly go away. It sank out of the newspapers and settled into the longer memory, into the books and the retellings, into the quiet standing it has held ever since as the case that could not be solved. The clamour was of its moment, and passed with its moment. The silence underneath the clamour was permanent, and it is the silence, not the clamour, that has come down to us. For everything that was said in that loud summer, and a great deal was said, the essential matter was never spoken, because no one who could speak it would, and no one who would speak it could. The persons who knew, if any of them knew, held their peace to the end. The evidence that might have compelled the knowledge out of them did not exist, and so the loudest inquiry of its day rested at last upon a silence it could not fill, and handed that silence forward, intact, to every year that has followed, which has received it and kept it, and been no more able to fill it than the inquiry was. The plainest way to hold the whole of it, in the end, is to hold the two facts that the record establishes beyond argument and to set beside them the one fact it withholds. The first established fact is that Charles Bravo died of a large dose of tartar emetic, an antimony poison, taken into his body in the hours before his final illness. The second established fact is that this was found by a coroner's jury after the fullest examination the age could give it to be willful murder. The withheld fact, the third that would complete the account, and never will, is the identity of the person who administered the poison, or the confirmation that the man administered it to himself. Two certainties and one void, and the void does not shrink with study, and the certainties do not fill it. A reader may turn the case over as many times as patience allows, and will arrive, each time, at the same shape, the firm ground of the poison, and the murder, and the sudden drop into the dark where the name should be. That shape is the case, and it has been the case from the August the jury rose to the present hour. Nothing has been added that alters it, and nothing has been lost that would have completed it. The house stands, the record survives, the argument continues, and the answer does not come. A young man drank from a bottle at his bedside in a white villa in Balham in the spring of that year, and died of it in 3 days, and the fullest inquiry his century could mount established every surrounding thing, and could not establish the one thing that mattered, and the death has kept it secret through all the time between then and now. There is in every account of a death like this a natural wish for it to end somewhere, for the long approach through evidence and testimony to arrive at a door and open it. The mind that follows a case wants a conclusion, as the body that climbs a stair wants a landing, and most cases of the century granted the wish, delivered the accused to the dock, and the verdict to the accused, and the ending to the reader who had waited for it. This case grants no landing. It climbs and climbs through the night of the illness, and the parade of physicians, and the 2 inquests, and the 23 days, and at the top of the stair there is no door, only the open air, and the long drop of the unanswered question. The reader who has followed it faithfully to the end is left standing where the jury stood, with everything gathered and nothing concluded, holding a certainty that a murder was done, and a blank where the murderer's name should be. And it may be that this refusal to conclude is the truest thing the case has to teach, truer than any of the solutions pressed upon it in the years since. Some deaths do not resolve. Some questions, asked in earnest by capable people with every means at their disposal, return no answer, and the honest course is to say so plainly, rather than to force a name where the evidence supplies none. The record of the Balham death says so plainly. It sets out all that can be known, marks clearly the place, where knowledge ends and declines to pretend that the place is anywhere but where it is. The murder is certain. The hand is unknown. The record does not establish it, and it does not permit anyone, then or since, to say that it does. Each time the case is taken up again, and it has been taken up many times, the same temptation presents itself and must be refused. The temptation is to choose. The materials seem to ask for a choice, to lay the 4 possibilities side by side and invite the reader to prefer one, and it is a rare reader who resists preferring. But the preference, however strongly felt, is not a finding, and the honest retelling keeps the 2 apart. It may set out the case against the wife, and feel the force of it, and set out the answer, and feel the force of that, and it must stop where the evidence stops, which is short of a verdict. It may do the same for the companion, and for the groom, and for the possibility that the man took the poison himself, and it must stop each time at the same short distance from the name. To go further is to leave the record and enter invention, and the record of this death has been enough abused by invention already, by a century of confident solutions that the evidence never supported. The discipline the case demands is the discipline of the unfinished sentence, the willingness to carry the account faithfully to the edge of what is known and to leave it there, unclosed, because unclosed is what it truly is. So it is left, the poison is named, and the murder is declared, and the 4 who stood within the circle are set down with the case that can be made against each and the answer that can be made for each. And beyond that, the record does not go, because beyond that there is nothing the record can honestly say. The death of Charles Bravo remains what the jury found it, a willful murder by a hand that could not be named, and the years have neither named the hand nor unmade the murder, and the account closes, as the inquiry closed, upon that single settled and unyielding fact.